Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show. We have a special guest with us tonight. Rania Kalik is a journalist and correspondent for Redfish. She's known in particular for her reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and also done work on the Syrian civil war. Her work has been featured in The Nation, The Intercept, Al Jazeera, Salon, Vice, and Truth Out. She's also been interviewed on numerous television and internet shows, including Chris Hedges' RT's On Contact, The Real News, Shadowproof, and RT America. Welcome, Renia. Thank you so much for being our guest.
It's so good to be on with you, Jimmy.
So, I've said many times on this show that the mainstream news media does not tell us the truth about foreign policy or our wars. In fact, I did a report where everything the mainstream news media is telling you about Syria is a lie. And people are often blown away. In fact, they don't believe me when I tell them that our own government funded ISIS and al-Qaeda to fight in Syria against Assad. So again, it's like everything you think you know about Syria isn't true. So you've actually been there. You've reported on it. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions that Americans have about the Syrian war, and what do you think they need to know?
Well, they have this big misconception, first and foremost, that the U.S. didn't do anything in Syria, that the big problem in Syria is the U.S. didn't intervene. When in Syria, the opposition that was U.S. backed and Western backed is probably one of the best funded, best armed oppositions in the history of any opposition group ever. The U.S. was giving something like $1 billion, up to $1 billion a year to like a bunch of different rebel groups in Syria that were basically ultimately all working alongside or in fact a part of al-Qaeda. And so we are essentially the U.S. This is, I mean, the most shocking aspect of what we did in Syria is that the U.S. was essentially helping the group that was responsible for doing 9/11. I mean, it's kind of shocking to even say that. It sounds like some sort of joke, like a bad joke, but that's what happened. And then the next level with Syria is beyond that. It's like the level of, I mean, actually, Syria is probably the first issue where, I mean, I just never seen the level of propaganda that we saw when it came to the Syrian war. It was to such an extreme degree. And the reason I know that is because not only because I was there, but also I have family in Syria. And I used to be one of these people who kind of believed in the other side when it came to Syria, the idea that there was this sort of like, legitimate like armed uprising that was just trying to fight the government, like some like romantic uprising. But the thing is, I have family in Syria. And when your family's involved and your family like is surrounded by al-Qaeda, it quickly becomes clear what's actually happening on the ground. So yeah, I would say that's probably the biggest issue with Syria, though, is that Americans have no idea that their government helped create what is now the biggest al-Qaeda affiliate in the history of al-Qaeda in Idlib in Syria. And as a result, I mean, this is something that's going to have consequences for decades to come. And when there's an attack down the line and it comes from this particular group, Americans are going to have no idea the role that their government played. And it's a lot like what America did in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which was fund jihadist groups to fight the Soviets. And then not long after that, these jihadist groups that America funded, the Mujahideen, transformed into al-Qaeda. And then you have 9/11.
So we didn't learn our lesson, is what you're saying, because we used to refer to Osama bin Laden as a freedom fighter. When he was fighting against the Russians, we called him a freedom fighter, and then he certainly quickly turned his guns on us. So we're doing the same thing where we're fighting ISIS, or we claim to be fighting them in other, like in Libya or in Iraq. Yet here we are propping up the most extreme factions in Syria. And why, can you tell me why that is? Why does the United States want to overthrow Assad, and why were they willing to get in bed with terrorists we're fighting in other parts of the world to do it?
Well, I mean, this is kind of historically what the U.S. has done. The U.S. has used Islamists, historically speaking, has used Islamists against its adversaries in the Middle East for a long time. And so Syria was just kind of another chapter in that ongoing pattern. The U.S. has this sort of like love-hate relationship with Islamists in the Middle East. When it suits like American needs, the U.S. is fine to stand by them and call them freedom fighters. And then when it suits America's interest to bomb Islamists, the U.S. is fine to say, oh, they're all terrorists. And what's actually funny, I mean, when you look at the Middle East, who's America's best friend in the region other than Israel? It's Saudi Arabia, the most extremist government in probably the history of the world. In modern day, at least. I mean, it's like some medieval place where people are, stoned to death for sorcery. But that's beside the point. The U.S. and Syria, the reason that the U.S. wanted to overthrow Assad, and I just want to I feel like I always have to qualify my comments with this, but it's whenever you're in the situation where you're talking about what the U.S. is doing in the region, everybody automatically points to you and calls you a dictator lover if you're against U.S. Intervention in the region. And I just want to point out, not a fan of the Syrian government, not a fan of really any government in the region. But this is just about, what the U.S. has done, and it's making the situation worse. And the reason the U.S. wanted to overthrow the Syrian government is because the Syrian government is a part of what they call the axis of resistance in the Middle East. That's what people call it. And that is basically countries and groups like Syria, Iran, Hezbollah that basically refuse to bow down to American interests and Israeli interests and Saudi interests in the region. And that's not allowed. Doesn't matter if they're good or bad players. It's just the fact that if you don't do what America wants, then America will get rid of you. That's kind of how it works in the region. And so that's why Assad had to go, is because the Syrian government was a part of that resistance axis. And the thing that's amazing is it didn't work. It was a massive failure. The U.S. totally lost. And now they're completely confused and don't really know what they're doing in the region. And they've actually only made their adversaries stronger.
So is there anything to Robert Kennedy Jr. reported that there was a pipeline that they wanted to send through Syria to bring natural gas to Europe, and that's why Putin is so staunch of a supporter of the Assad regime or the Assad government, because he wants to sell the natural gas to Europe, and now he doesn't need that competition. So that's one big reason why he's supporting them. Is there any? Do people talk about that pipeline? How much of a factor is that pipeline? I mean, there's lots of factors into this war, but that's certainly one of them. No.
I wouldn't say it's not a factor. It's not really something I know much about. But I mean, when it comes to natural resources in the region, it's something that's always involved and always a factor. That said, I actually think one of the reasons that Russia got involved in Syria had more to do with the fact that they watched what happened in Libya unfold. And it was such a massive disaster. And that came after Iraq. And for Russia, the jihadist threat is closer to home than it is for the U.S., right. Just like it's closer to home for Europe. If you destroy Middle Eastern countries and overrun them with jihadists, it has a massive, the consequences on Europe, as we've seen, have been massive. They've had this massive influx of refugees. And also, Russia's not that far away either. Russia also is surrounded by countries like Chechnya and other countries that are sort of like these hotbeds for jihadist fighters. So Russia is actually more interested, I think, and this is not, again, to say the Russian government's great. It's just I think the Russian government is more interested in stability in the region, whereas the U.S. is more interested in a system of chaos. And so Syria was just kind of a matter of the Russian government, A, standing by its ally because they saw what happened in Libya, and they didn't want to see that happen again, and B, also making sure ISIS didn't take over Syria, because the Russian government didn't really get involved in Syria until 2015 when ISIS really threatened Damascus. And had they not gotten involved, this is just the reality of the situation, had Russia not gotten involved, you would have seen black flags flying over the capital in Syria.
Right. So recently, Trump made a decision to stop funding. I don't know if they've done it, but he's publicly said they've decided to stop funding the opposition in Syria, whether you want to call it ISIS, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda. He said that they stopped funding them, and now it seems like this quote-unquote civil war or the fight against the terrorists or the insurgents, it seems to be almost over now, right? About 90% over after the United States decided to stop funding them and stop pushing for an overthrow of Assad. Now it seems like there's peace, and there's a chance for peace, correct?
Yeah, there's definitely a chance now for reconciliation, there's been a bunch. It's something you haven't really heard about, that there's been reconciliation agreements across towns in Syria for a few years now, kind of slowly building and snowballing, and now it's becoming a bigger issue. And now, yes, you are able to see more stability. People's lives are returning to a somewhat normal lives, where they can at least try to start rebuilding. And that's only because not just the U.S., but all of the players that were funding the opposition in Syria have stopped funding and arming the al-Qaeda-linked opposition in Syria. And that is why you see such a dramatic change in the trajectory of the war, which is now winding down. And you don't even really see it in the news as much anymore. It's kind of like a non-issue now.
Right.
No one's talking about Syria anymore. All that regime change money is dried up. And so, yeah, I mean, and that kind of shows you that, any sort of opposition group that's that dependent on outside financing and outside funding and arms isn't really genuine or authentic or, really popular among the people. But either way, I mean, it's pretty much died down and it's over. And now what you're seeing happening is you're seeing a lot of the rhetoric that was aimed at Syria now being aimed more at Iran. And you're seeing the U.S. sort of like, especially under Trump, which is fascinating because Trump was talking so much during the campaign about moving away from radical Islam, and now he's like befriended Saudi Arabia probably more than any other administration ever. And you see this sort of weird alliance form between the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel very openly, and they want a war with Iran somehow. They just don't know how to do it because it's what's hilarious about Syria, and it's just really ironic, is that the U.S. has done a lot of what's done in the region to try and weaken Iran and the groups that Iran supports, and it's done the exact opposite. Iran is much, much stronger in the region, and it's been actually a force of stability in the region. And so that's going to be like the future conflict in the Middle East down the line, is this attempt to try and weaken Iran in different ways. But I'm really not sure what other tools the U.S. has at this point.